1 Corinthians chapter 7, 1 through 16. I know it's different than what's in your bulletin, but chapter 7, verses 1 through 16 is where we are. And Paul starts out saying, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps for agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now as a concession, not a command, I say this: I wish that all were as myself am. But each has his own gift from God, and one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and the widows I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. To the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord: the wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does, she should remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise your children may be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife?" Like I said, these verses scream Father's Day. But they have a lot to do with things that are very applicable today. We look for marriage advice oftentimes in every secular book you can find, and we ignore some of the marriage advice that we see in the Bible. Maybe because it doesn't fit the narrative that we have nowadays, or doesn't fit the traditions that we've developed over the last several years, or for whatever reason, oftentimes we come to passages like these and we shy away from them. And I prefer today not to do that, but I'm not going to linger on some of the main topics of them. I'm just going to cover them pretty quickly, but I want to make a couple of points really quick. One is I want us to notice how much change there has been in the marriage age from 1890 to today. Most people are somewhere between 10 and 12 years older when they marry today than they did even 50 or 60 years ago. And a lot of that is because we've put a lot of impetus on careers and college, and wait until you have your life together before you get married. And I just want to say that as we've seen that number go up, we've also seen this number go up. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, 19.5 million children, more than 1 in 4, live without a father in the home. It's a devastating thing to think about the fact that 1 in 4 in our country have no father present in their home. It's an important thing to remember. Like I said earlier, when we think about Father's Day, it's easy to think about the good times and the things that we enjoyed about growing up with our fathers. But it's also important to remember that as men in this congregation today, we have a responsibility to be the father that we're supposed to be to the kids that God has given us, because far too many of them grow up without us involved. So it's important. So as we jump into what he's doing today, I want us to remember that fact. But finally, there's a question. It's important to remember that all we've talked about in 1 Corinthians thus far was not stuff that they wrote him asking. It's probably things that they were upset, maybe even embarrassed about, the subjects of division or immorality in the church, their failure to deal with it properly, lawsuits among believers, all of those things, none of them did they ask for his advice on. On this one, it appears they did. They're asking whether or not it's good or bad to be married. That's why he says, now concerning the matters about which you wrote, is it good? It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But really the question had more to do with, should you marry? And he says that in verse 2. But because of the temptation of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. When you look at these verses, the question might appear to agree with some things that currently are fads or the new way of doing things. Live together first before you get married, or other things. And it can look like it supports that right off the bat because it talks about not engaging in sexual relations. The problem is we don't live with one another that way. We usually, if we're going to live with one another, we're sleeping with them already. That's why he tells them, but because of temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. He's just trying to help them understand that sex in marriage is good, sex outside of marriage is a sin. It's important that we remember those things. We don't teach about them very often nowadays. As a matter of fact, it's celebrated much the other way. If you watch much social media or regular media or just TV, sex sells everything. And we've forgotten the truths that are taught in the Bible about marriage and the guide rails for our sexual behavior that's supposed to be encompassed in that. Some people are never given or maybe even able to resist the urge to sexual relations, but even Paul acknowledged that was few and far between. So let's move on to three truths that Paul's trying to teach us here about marriage, since marriage seems to be his answer for dealing with some of the sexual immorality that was an issue for them and in some ways for us. So particularly as fathers, I think it's important that we remember that marriage is a God-intended safeguard. It's supposed to be something that helps us to resist temptation. It's not the thing that causes us to sin. We make more jokes about the things our wives do and say and use them as excuses for why we say and do some of the things that we say and do. But marriage was intended to be a safeguard. It's why he says, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. Because of the temptation to sexual immorality, they needed some safeguard, some way that they could exercise this in a God-ordained fashion. And that fashion was within the bounds of marriage. Not only that, but that marriage was supposed to carry with it a certain level of sexual engagement that was going to keep us from looking outside of the relationship, seeking other things, whether it was an actual engagement or pornography or who knew what else. It's supposed to be a safeguard. It's supposed to be something where I can exercise the God-given talents, desires, all of those things, but with the person that I've committed to, and her as well in my way. Marriage is definitely a God-intended safeguard. It's also sacrificial. When they say these words in 7:5, sometimes we focus on the latter part of the verse, but I want you to focus on these first few words. Do not deprive one another. Your rights in marriage are not your primary concern. They're not supposed to be. My primary concern is supposed to be about my spouse. which is one of the reasons why Paul tells us later in 7, which we'll get to in a couple weeks, that we can sometimes be double-minded because we worry so much about pleasing one another that God takes a back seat. But marriage is supposed to be sacrificial. It's supposed to be me trying to find some way to show honor and respect to my wife, and not always me demanding that she show honor and respect to me. It's like we talked about last week. Sometimes when we engage in disagreements, we're more interested in being proven right than being proven holy. But marriage is designed to be sacrificial. And the third thing is that marriage can be salvific. He says in 1 Corinthians 7:16, "For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife?" It's the importance of understanding that oftentimes you may be the only Christ that the other person sees. My story is pretty well documented about how Carmen came to faith several years before I did, that she continued to witness to me and to try to help me see, no matter how resistant I was, but ultimately 3 years later I surrendered my life to the Lord, and here we are. But lots of that was because she chose to stick it out and to attempt to reason and talk to an unbeliever, and to help me see and know who Christ was. And as such, marriage can be salvific. Particularly when it comes to fathers, that carries weight because of the impact that fathers have on families. Particularly when you look at studies like this. One study from the mid-1990s found that 82% of adolescents identified their mother's influence as a positive factor in their spiritual development. 82% of those that they talked to said that their mother's faith played a part in their faith, while only 69% identified the father as a positive factor. As fathers, what it tells me is one, we're not being vocal enough about our faith, and we're not being consistent enough about the way we live it out. Too often we are outdone. Our wives are much better at displaying Christ to our children than we are. If both father and mother attend regularly, 33% of their children will end up as regular churchgoers, and 41% will end up attending irregularly. Only 1/4 of their children would end up not practicing at all. 1 in 4, something we saw earlier about fathers not being present too. Only 1/4 of their children. If the father is irregular and the mother regular, only 3% of the children will subsequently become regular themselves. I say all those things and point them out not so we get lost in statistics, but so that we understand that we have a responsibility to be influential in our relationships, not just to our wives, but to our children behind us. Otherwise, this would simply be Husband's Day, but it's Father's Day, because we're supposed to display for them what it looks like to follow Christ, what it looks like to honor their mother, what it looks like to be willing to be salvific in the way that we treat our family. One of the greatest blessings of my life, and maybe many of yours as well, was watching my children be baptized, both of them. Helping to play a part in them coming to know the Lord. It was a tremendous blessing for me, the ability to get to do that. You guys have probably by this point, at some point in time, read or seen where they put the statistics out that say if a child comes to faith, somewhere in the neighborhood of 3% of the time, the remainder of the family comes to faith. If the mother comes to faith first, it's somewhere in the 40% range that the rest of the family will come to faith. And when the father is the first that's saved, 93% of families come to faith. We have a much higher responsibility than we often take in this regard. Ladies were blessed with an innate ability to nurture. But we are supposed to be gifted with talents that lead us to lead our families spiritually. But yet, 82% of children find their faith more impacted by their mother. It's something to challenge ourselves with. In a world that seems to be increasingly telling us how invaluable fathers are, the church cannot afford to make that same mistake. These passages deal a lot with the fact that temptations can abound and that marriage becomes one of these three things when it's practiced properly, that it does become a safeguard and it becomes sacrificial and it becomes salvific. But one of the things that's not addressed in these passages is the children of that, other than simply to say that children may be unclean if the believing spouse leaves. Father's Day is a great holiday where we get the opportunity to stop and take a moment and thank those men that have been influences in our lives, who have been a part of our upbringing, but more than that, more than any sought honor in that aspect should be our commitment to raising godly children and helping them to be raised in godly homes with godly marriages. It is worth preserving your marriage, because the kids and each other and the witness we have to the world, all of those things are impacted by those things. So today, you want to be a good father? Well, be a good father to your children and be a good husband to your wife. Make sure that today is not a day where you're just simply honored. Make sure it's a day where you are honoring the things God has given you. The wife, the children, the church, the family that surrounds you, that lifts you up. And that today, as we go and celebrate, it's always been kind of the pastoral joke that on Mother's Day, everybody comes to church with their mom, and on Father's Day, everybody goes to the lake with their dad. To a degree, that's true. Mother's Day is like the second or third highest attended day in church, which might tell us something as fathers if we'll hear it. Our children don't think it's honoring to us to come to church with them on Father's Day, but our mothers have conveyed that message well to their kids. So today, as you go out and you engage your children, make sure that part of your engagement is helping them to understand just how much of a blessing God is in your life and how you desire to pass it along to them.